These are indeed strange times, and we are grateful to be able to communicate to you through the internet, through our online programs. It is difficult, in all honesty, to be sitting here tonight and speak when we know that so many people are in distress right now. And it is my personal hope that this sharing tonight will be meaningful and will be helpful in some way. This is a moment I feel that we could use to reset, to press the reset button. As you have experienced many times here in your own personal life, from time to time, life comes to our aid to shake us, to wake us up. And you can call that life, you can call that God or karma, your own actions returning. And this is what I feel we are experiencing right now as humanity. We are offered the opportunity to wake up and to reset. We have also been forced to act and think as a unit, to understand what it means to be one. And this is a wonderful experience from that perspective. So I really hope that we don't waste this precious opportunity and that we use this momentum to reshape where we are going as humanity and as individuals. So if tonight you are experiencing sickness or loss, I hope you find comfort in this teaching that I will share with you from the Cloud of Unknowing. If you're sheltering in place, I hope you find strength to sustain others. The subject that brings us together tonight is appropriate no matter the external circumstances, through worldly storms, mystic calm. But the subject is mostly about God and prayer, turning to God and turning to prayer. And I cannot think of any moment in any life in which we wouldn't appreciate or value the possibility of turning to God and turning to prayer. I will share with you some of the key aspects of this book that is called The Cloud of Unknowing. And it's a book that was written by an anonymous author in the second half of the 14th century. It was, this one particular copy is translated by Carmen Acevedo Butcher, which I really recommend. It's a wonderful translation. And we will use that one throughout this sharing. This book was written during a very particularly difficult time in England and in Europe. At the time, there was another pandemic, a much harder pandemic than the one we are experiencing right now, the bubonic plague. And England was also having a very long war with France, the 100-Year War that was longer than 100 years. And you can imagine the circumstances in which people were living at the time. I think right now we all can imagine. Because, right now we have technology and information and many ways of dealing with this. But think of this time in the 14th century. And in spite of this difficult, very difficult time, there was a surge of mysticism. There was this current underneath the surface, underneath the storm, flourishing and staying together and staying in touch, actually. Because this book is the letters to a senior monk, to a new monk, a disciple, someone who was learning about contemplative prayer. I am going to assume this was a monk and not a nun, and that he was talking to another monk based on what Carmen Acevedo says. And so I will be calling anonymous him and his. This book, I feel, is for all of us. And if you are able to read a text without getting too caught up on the particular language of a particular religion, you will be able to spot very many things that you are familiar with and many treasures. I believe this book has changed me. This book changed the way I perceived God. It changed my practice. So I owe a lot to it, to this teacher that decided to write to another person and to whoever decided to publish it as a book later on. The book is about the direct experience of God through contemplative prayer. And unfortunately, both these terms, God and prayer, have been so misunderstood and misused throughout history. And for lack of understanding, or for putting so many personal elements into these two aspects, a lot of people that could relate to God, both to God and prayer, right now don't. They reject both the idea of God or the idea of prayer just because of the way they were defined. But mysticism kept the beauty of both. It kept the reality of both, because through the mystical practice, they were able to become in direct contact with it, with both contemplative prayer and the experience of the divine. So I would like us to start by doing a little bit of an exercise of undefining God. And this is something that I invite you to do on your own, even after this talk is over. Just for a moment, try to forget everything you have read, everything you've known, everything you have heard about God and the concept of God. Can you suspend your thinking, your judgment, your thinking process, your memory, the information that you have gathered about God in the past, and start afresh, start new, and ask yourself, where do you experience God? What is your own experience of God? We have allowed organized religion and other people to define for us the most sacred experience of the human being, of the human existence. Isn't it that strange? So can we spend some time pondering about this? What is my relationship, experience with the divine? For me, personally. It doesn't matter what my neighbor thinks, or my parents, or the religion I grew up in. And the reason why I'm asking you to do this is because I had my own struggles with the concept of God, and to relate to it in a way that was helpful for spiritual unfoldment. I grew up in Argentina in a very Christian environment, and but at the same time, and I loved going to church, and I resonated with the Christian teachings. And at the same time, I was raised by Theosophists, and in the Theosophical teachings, on one hand, you have on Christianity a very personal God, while in the Theosophical teachings, you find a very abstract God, an absolute reality, immutable, the rootless root of all that exists. And both aspects are important and useful. But unless you can understand them and make them part of your experience, they can create a lot of confusion. Or they can disassociate you from the experience of love, for example. You can imagine that if I was, let's say, born with a more devotional nature, and I was trying to connect with absolute abstract space, that would have been kind of like an impossible to develop a relationship of love toward that idea. So, but I find that concept, very abstract idea of God, useful to challenge our mind and to push ourselves in the direction of eternity, and that is very helpful. But again, however, when I had to sit down and go within into my heart, it was hard for me to relate to that concept, and it helped me a lot more to begin with a love that was closer to me, whether it was through a master of wisdom, an enlightened being, or God, maybe perhaps in a more personal way, or even our own higher self. So this is an invitation for you to revise, to think, what is that speaks to you when you practice? What is that speaks to you when you live? Because this is your experience, and it should be so. The first gem that I want to share from this book is something that says, if you want to find your soul, look at what you love. That's where your soul lives. So again, another question. What do you love? What awakens you to love? Can you love that which you don't know? Can love be cultivated? Like in all traditions and in all paths, there's always a foundation and a certain requisites for this path. And in this case, as you have seen in other Christian mystics, this teacher talks about humility, discernment, faith, and love being the most important one of all. And so this practice that actually we will do the practice at the end, because even though the book is very rich in a lot of helpful information, wise, full of common sense, I truly recommend that if you have a chance to read this book. But it also delineates a practice, and I would like us to do the practice at the end. I think it's very appropriate for this time. So the first aspect that he points out and talks about quite in depth is humility and the cultivation of humility. And the first thing I'll share is this that says, never confuse the worthiness of your calling with who you are. Never confuse the worthiness of your calling with who you are. Our aspirations can be very high, but we need to become aware of reality, who we are right now. And this is the beginning of the path to humility, self-knowledge. Humility is seeing ourselves as we are, no more nor less, just that, who we are. And who we are changes, hopefully a little bit every day. Perhaps it changes less than that. Every other year or so, we feel there are a few changes happening. And so our self-knowledge, the process of self-knowledge, is ongoing, and it ends with our life. So the task is to get to know ourselves. And embrace that fact. Embrace the fact that it is important to know who we are and how we react and what's happening in our heart, what's happening in our minds. He says the best way to get and keep humility is this: continue doing what's right. Be strong. Look forward and let go of what happened yesterday. Look at your weaknesses, not at your strengths, and pay attention to what you still need to do instead of rehearsing in your mind what you have already accomplished. Probably not a very popular idea at this time that we're living, but looking at our, things taken out of context can be also sometimes misinterpreted. So it's important that you understand the background of his thinking. And he's not by any means suggesting that we feel we strengthen our weaknesses, by thinking of them. No, it's just looking at them, becoming aware of them, and not rehearse in our mind our strengths. It's like I was thinking of, sometimes when you clean your house, you start with the room and it's looking so tidy and clean and perfect, and but then you have the rest of the house to clean. And, it is as if you would just stay there contemplating what you have achieved and forget about the fact that you have still the rest of the house. Yes, it can serve as inspiration. From time to time you stop by and say, this is my goal, I'm going to make the other rooms look like this. But you get the idea. It's important to see our weaknesses as well. So no need to do this with remorse or a sense of defeat. He says, I want you to evaluate every thought you have, develop an awareness of how each one influences your behavior. So this is mostly about self-knowledge. Right now, we're quite familiar with becoming aware of our thoughts, and it is because of the great influence of Buddhism in the West. But think of this time in the 14th century. This to me is interesting. I want you to evaluate every thought you have, develop an awareness of how each one influences your behavior. Work hard at mental vigilance, not allowing the entrance of certain thoughts. Work on mental vigilance. So this talk about a certain type of dispassion. And of course, in an impartial way. We're not seeking to be judgmental about ourselves. But if we spot something that we want to change, well, let's do something about it. When we notice that we have habitual patterns that are not helpful or conducive to our spiritual life, well, we have the power to change that at any given time. So then there are quite a few things about discernment and faith and love that we will look into as we go along. Something that the book is going to go over and over again toward is that God is not known through thought and through the thinking process. And we have seen this if you have watched the lecture on St. John of the Cross. This was very clear also in St. John's teachings. And there is so much value in thought and understanding. I said this book changed my life, and I couldn't have done that without the thinking process, without the intellect. But we cannot think our way to God. Those two things are very different. So I can use this book as a pointer, as suggestions, as something that is telling me in which direction to look. But that in itself is not going to bring the experience of love. It's not going to bring the direct experience of what is divine. Those are very different things. And he says, even the holiest thoughts can obstruct rather than help the contemplative work. And in this particular case, he's talking about the contemplative prayer. It doesn't, in his opinion, it doesn't help much to think good things as you sit in this prayer. Like in Buddhism, you see that thinking of good things as you sit is not necessarily conducive to the stillness of the mind, to quieting. I am willing to abandon everything I know to love the one thing I cannot think. Thought is accessible, it's handy. Anybody can think thoughts. Love, on the other hand, not so much. It's not that easy to love, and we just only need to look at the state of the world to realize that. I think right now we are reconsidering ourselves and the way we've been acting. But this is an extraordinary circumstance, and hopefully we will make good use of it. And he continues to say, every rational creature, every person, and every angel has two main strengths: the power to know and the power to love. God made both of these, but he's not knowable through the first one. To the power of love, however, he is entirely known. Throughout the book, he makes a lot of warnings about different things. You know, every path has its difficulties, and it is very helpful that a teacher tells you, careful with this, don't do that, watch out for this, watch out for that. And he says, I do not want people sitting around analyzing, racking their brains, their curiosity forcing their imagination to go entirely the wrong way. It's not natural. It's not wise for the mind. And it's not healthy for the body. These people are dangerously deluded, and it would take a miracle to save them. And he, in this particular case, and I'm bringing it because I think it's important, he was writing for someone who was a monk, and in those contexts in which you isolate yourself and you are trying to live a spiritual life, even a little harder than when you are, with a family, with worldly responsibilities. And it was quite common for people to go off center, which is something that can happen to all of us when we don't use our discernment, when perhaps we go into extremes and forget about the importance of being centered and being balanced. He says, if by grace you make love your own, do. For the experience is eternal joy. Its absence is unending suffering. And this eternal joy comes when the mind is still. So it's important to value both aspects of it. Keep an active mind. Just know when to stop. And this particular practice that he shares with us, the contemplative prayer, is about exactly that. It's about becoming perfectly still and open, receptive to the influence of the divine power. So here we come to this point of asking, what is prayer? Normally people associate prayer with the vocal prayer, the one that you just repeat a certain series of words, sentences that are connected to your own tradition. Prayer as vocal prayer, the repetition of words. But prayer can be a lot more than that. And it is indeed, especially in the contemplative prayer. When understood properly, prayer is nothing but an intense longing for God. An intense longing for what's real, for what is union, returning home. We can also consider it a conversation with God, a moment we spend in the presence of God. We are always in the presence of God, but can we turn fully, completely into that presence? In the Buddhist tradition, when I was reading this book, I was also reading Mindfulness, Bliss, and Beyond by Ajahn Brahm, and I found so many parallels and similarities and things that spoke to one another. And for me, it was so helpful to read these two books at the same time. And I couldn't help but relating this subject, toward Christianity and toward Buddhism and toward a meditation practice. I remember Ajahn Brahm saying, when you sit in meditation, you are going to spend this time with your favorite person in the whole world. And, from the Christian point of view, that would be God. But from the Buddhist point of view, is yourself. But is that contradictory? No, it's not at all. You're going to spend time with this person who is also divine. And eventually the experience, I'm not saying that it's going to be the same, but it's going to lead us in the same direction. And I believe it's going to take us to the same place. So we're called to pray with an intensity reaching the height, the depth, the length, and the breadth of our whole being. Pray simply and often. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't require anything, and it doesn't even require for us to sit down or put time aside for it, which is useful and we can. But I think it's important to remember that prayer is our life, like meditation is our life. Yes, we sit and we do our practice in an isolated place because it's a more intense type of practice. But prayer and meditation are a way of living. Don't stop your prayers until the thing you long for is achieved. And reading this out of context, you may think that he was a bit ambitious, but it has nothing to do with that. It reminded me actually of something Joel Goldsmith said in his writings. He said that he sat every day to have this conversation with God, and until he felt the presence of God in some way, he didn't get up from his chair. And by his writings and the nature of his being, you can tell that this wasn't at all ambition. This is my duty. If I'm here, I wait. If I'm calling and I'm knocking at this door, I wait for the door to open before I stand up and leave. So it's just something to reflect on. I know that most of us don't have that opportunity to stay there until we want. Sometimes, we have to get up and start the day. But just consider that and what it means. And then stop hesitating. Do this work until you feel the delight of it. In the trying is the desire. Sometimes we feel that if we don't have the desire, we don't need to try. But this teacher is telling us that in the trying comes the desire, the longing to unite. he talks about time and how to use it. Take good care of your time. Watch how you spend it, for nothing is more precious. In the twinkling of an eye, heaven can be won or lost. Here's how we know time is precious. God, the giver of time, never gives us 2 moments simultaneously. That way, none of us has an excuse on Judgment Day. We won't be able to say, you gave me 2 moments at once to my every single impulse. And this is, in my opinion, a beautiful way of describing present moment awareness. You know, we don't have the excuse to say, I'm going to be divided in these 2 impulses because I have 2 moments. I was given 2 moments. I was just given this moment, this eternal now. This is what I was giving. So some people, he says, some people believe that contemplation is time-consuming. But it's not. In fact, it takes less time than anything else you'll ever do. Because it is here. You don't need to go anywhere or do anything. That doesn't take any time at all. And it can happen in this eternal now. It's as brief as an atom, as in the sense of the smallest particle of time. So then, he's going to introduce the 2 most important aspects of this practice, which is the cloud of unknowing and then the cloud of forgetting. The first time you practice contemplation, he says, you will only experience a darkness, like a cloud of unknowing. You won't know what this is. You will only know that in your will you feel a simple reaching out to God. And we can all relate to this. How many times have you, especially when you started meditating or when you started praying, sitting there in that darkness where nothing happens, and you think, what am I doing here? Is this even working? Where am I going with all this? But this goes beyond that first initial perception of the meditation or the prayer. He's talking about this cloud of unknowing as the darkness that will always be between you and God. And here we go back to the teachings of St. John of the Cross, in the sense that for the intellect, God is like darkness. You must also know, he says, that this darkness and this cloud will always be between you and your God, whatever you do. They will always keep you from seeing Him clearly by the light of understanding in your intellect, and will block you from feeling Him fully in the sweetness of love in your emotions. And this is because our personal nature doesn't participate in the union. Our personal nature is left behind, is left awaiting. And of course it receives all the blessing and the grace from it, perhaps not in a conscious way. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Remember passages from St. Teresa of Avila saying, the more I wanted to see Him, the least I could. The more she tried to reach out with her personal desire, the less she was able to see or to perceive. So that part of us needs to be still. So be sure, he says, you make your home in this darkness. And when I say darkness, I mean the absence of knowing. Going back to the beginning, what is God? We may be able to say that it is the unknown. We may be able to say that there are some aspects of God that we know, but in what way? Is it the knowing that we are familiar with, or is it a different type of knowing? So work diligently in this nothing, which is nowhere. This cloud of unknowing he describes as above you, between you and God. And of course, this is just an image and a metaphor. He's not really talking about a cloud between us and God. But this relationship of simply expecting or simply being receptive and open toward what is unknown. And to this cloud, he added the cloud of forgetting. The cloud of forgetting is something that he places underneath us. So it's underneath the cloud of forgetting, then us, then the cloud of unknowing, then God. And this is an image that, even though it's a metaphor, you can use. It can be helpful if you use it during your practice. You can use the image or not. We will try that in the practice today, and then it is your choice. But you can experiment with it and see how that feels and if that helps you. If you ever want, he says, if you ever want to make this cloud, the cloud of unknowing, an integral part of your life, complete the cloud of unknowing with the cloud of forgetting. To the cloud of unknowing above you, between you and your God, add the cloud of forgetting beneath you, between you and creation. And this is something that I even try throughout the day. From time to time, when I felt overwhelmed with something, or I noticed that there was a thought that wasn't helpful, I just, it was almost like an accident. It happened on its own. I've been doing this practice for a long time, and then all of a sudden, I was standing at the bookshop, and I noticed that there was some type of thought that I didn't want there, and I immediately dropped it in the cloud of forgetting. I just dropped it, and when I did that, I felt this lightness that I didn't need to carry that thought with me, or that heaviness, or whatever had happened earlier that morning. I could just drop it. And this is what the cloud of forgetting is. He says, contemplation requires us to hide all people and all things, past, present, and future, and all accomplishments under the cloud of forgetting. All things, material and spiritual, good and bad, no exceptions. And when it says, hide all things, it seems like he's saying, hide all things you don't like under the rug. And it's not what he means. He's not talking about repression or forgetting things that are important, or not to take care of aspects of our life that are still hurting us. That we go back to self-knowledge. When we notice that we have a certain type of thought or emotion and we become aware of it, then we have the opportunity to work with that through whether it's love or compassion or forgiveness. But he's talking about the things that, he's talking about the fact that to be able to fully connect with the divine, we need to leave the worldly things behind, and that includes all past experiences and all people and all knowledge. And sometimes we can do this temporarily as we practice, as we sit, before we begin, as we are going to do today. It's so helpful. But also then we can try in our lives. Are these memories something that I need to carry? Why? They don't add anything to this moment. So we can simply drop them. He says, if the cloud of unknowing makes you feel alienated from God, separated from God, that's only because you have not yet put a cloud of forgetting between you and everything in creation. And what he meant by this was that unless we started diminishing the attachments and our interest in those things, our connection with God will not begin to happen, or will be very weak. So we will feel that separation because we were still, the attachments and worldly things will be still pulling us down and taking our attention there. So the moment our cloud of forgetting becomes stronger, our connection with the divine also becomes stronger. And that is a beautiful image. It's so clear. You can see how when you attention and your interest and your love it's put in those things that are transitory, they are not being put in the things that are permanent. It's as simple as that. Either they are in one place or they are in the other. It's the same energy that we're using. And we can use it to become more and more entangled and engaged with emotions and thoughts, or we can use it to soften that relationship. The method itself, or the practice itself, and I call it a method for a reason. He says when we pray, we shouldn't use many words, but a little word of one syllable. And here I go back to Joel Goldsmith. He did the same thing. He used one word, the word God. We can all think of one word, one little word of one syllable that from time to time during the practice we may want to say every once in a while to come back to our intention and why we're sitting. What is it that we're seeking? And he says, so as part of the practice, and this is what we will be doing, he says, lift up your heart to God with a gentle stirring of love. And the first time I read this, I thought, what does that mean? And look at the choices of words in the sense that this is something you have to figure out by yourself. What does this mean? Lift up your heart to God with a gentle stirring of love. Focus on Him alone. Want Him and not anything He's made. Think of nothing but Him. Don't let anything else run through your mind and will. Here's how. Forget what you know. Forget everything God made and everybody who exists and everything that's going on in the world until your thoughts and emotions aren't focused on or reaching toward anything. Not in a general way and not in a particular way. Start practicing contemplation and watch how this spiritual exercise makes a difference in your life. When contemplation is genuine, it's nothing but a sudden impulse coming out of nowhere and flying up to God like a spark from a burning coal. And then he gives another piece of advice that has to do with the thoughts that become very pressing and interrupt the practice. And this is also so Buddhist. He says when exhausted from fighting your thoughts, when you're unable to put them down, he says, give up. Accept that it is foolish for you to fight them any longer. Do this and you'll find that in the hands of your enemies, you are surrendering to God. let yourself be defeated. Accept your failure. And I even remember when Ajahn Brahm was here and he was telling the story about struggling throughout a retreat so much with a certain type of thought and recurring thought. And he used all these strategies he knew, and he couldn't become still until he completely gave up. He actually went back to his cabin and lay down on the floor and gave up. And in that moment, when he completely gave up, there was stillness, there was silence. There was complete stillness. He says, my words have outlined what only experience can teach you clearly. So this is an outline of something we will only understand as we practice. We come to contemplation directly, not through certain techniques. They can't make it happen. No routine leads to love. No technique leads to the understanding of oneness. These are tools that we use, these are aids to cultivate certain states of being, but that's not what produces the changes or make us bring the experience of God. So we can only try to be receptive. So what really makes this happen, no routine leads to love. What leads to love then? And according to some of the mystics, or the Christian mystics at least, grace is what comes into the process. The grace of the divine. This is something that we receive, that we're giving. It's not something that we create. Yes, we set up the conditions, but it doesn't come from us, from this personality. If it comes from us, comes from a very pure and a very pure part of us, the light within, the highest within us. So grace is this divine response to a calling. We call, and there is this response. The awakening of the dormant light within. He says, in love and longing then, enter that cloud. Let God love draw you to Him. Let God's love draw you to Him. His kindness will teach you how to forget everything else. So this is the different type of knowing that I was talking about. By grace, you will allow the hidden love of your pure heart to press against the dark cloud of unknowing between you and God. And this, before we do our practice, I would like to read these few sentences, which are probably my favorite of all the ones I have shared tonight. Let God's grace do with you what it wants. Let it lead you wherever it wishes. Let it work and you receive. Don't meddle with it, trying to help as if you could assist grace. Instead, be the tree and let it be the carpenter. Become blind during contemplative prayer and cut yourself off from needing to know things. Be content, feeling moved in a delightful, loving way by something mysterious and unknown, leaving you focused entirely on God, with no other thought than of Him alone. Let your naked desire rest there. So I invite you now to sit comfortably wherever you are and closing your eyes for a moment Take a few deep inhalations. Soft and gentle exhalations. And with each breath, find your body more and more relaxed. Softening the skin. Relaxing eyelids and eyebrows. Use the exhalation to let go completely of all tension. Relax. Now, visually or symbolically, drop all past experiences. Leave behind all the people you've met, the experiences you have had. All you know and think you know. All your expectations. And ideas even about this practice. Leave behind all the present experiences, the current experiences. And center yourself in this moment. Bring your awareness to the center of your being. And lift up your heart with a gentle stirring of love. Every now and then you can say the word God or love. And remain fully receptive. Slowly and gently return to the sensations in the body. Noticing your whole being in this moment. Yourself sitting on a chair. Your feet on the ground. And very slowly begin to open your eyes. This was a very short example of what contemplative prayer can be. I hope it inspires you to look deeper into perhaps Christian mysticism or the teachings of the Cloud of Unknowing or the practices of contemplative prayer. Thank you for being here tonight and for your kind attention.